January 26th, 1945. Holtzwihr, France, was still months away, still unimaginable, still the kind of day no sane man could predict. But the boy who would stand alone on a burning tank destroyer began far from artillery smoke, far from the Vosges forests, far from the frozen fields where German armour tried one last time to break the American line. Long before he became the most decorated soldier in American history, Audie Murphy was just a barefoot Texas sharecropper's son, a kid who carried the weight of a collapsing family on shoulders that had not yet grown into the word man. He hunted, not for sport, but for supper, moving through cedar thickets with a single-shot .22 and a silence that would one day make him death itself in the French countryside. In those days, he stood maybe 5'5", maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, a child in any other world. But Depression-era Texas was not a world for children. It made weapons of necessity out of boys. He lied about his age when Pearl Harbor turned the nation into a storm. The Marines said no. The Navy said no. Even the Army wanted to say no until he stared them down with those pale blue eyes that didn't blink even when he was nervous. The recruiter marked him smaller than regulation, lighter than acceptable, older than he truly was, and slid his papers through with the kind of shrug that said, "The world is ending anyway. Let the kid try." Basic training did not turn him into a soldier. Hunger had already done that years before, but it gave him structure, gave him a weapon he wasn't supposed to be big enough to carry, gave him a destination that wasn't a cotton field. What shocked his instructors wasn't his aim, it was his endurance. He did not quit. He did not break. He simply endured quietly, stubbornly, with that same expression that would later terrify German officers who heard rumors about a small American who never missed. By the time he reached the invasion of Sicily in 1943, he was no longer the smallest man in the company. He was the one they watched. They didn't understand it at first. In Sicily's heat, climbing the dusty ridges around Palermo, marching through dried riverbeds where rocks clattered under boots, they saw him move like a man twice his size, but half as tired. He didn't brag. He didn't lecture. He didn't demand authority. But authority found him anyway. Combat has a way of stripping men down to their essentials, and what remained in Audie Murphy was a kind of controlled ferocity, a hunter's calm placed inside a war he did not start. His first kills came in a blur near Canicattì. German machine gunners ambushed his patrol, and Murphy shot first, fast, instinctively, dropping one and then the other with the same smooth breath he used when shooting rabbits back home. The sergeant who watched him said quietly, "That boy ain't right," but he followed it with, "Keep him close." Murphy learned quickly, not from manuals but from consequences. In Sicily's mountains, he learned to survive artillery by feeling its rhythm in his chest before he heard it. In the villages around Messina, he learned to clear houses with the fearlessness of a man who had grown numb to fear long before the uniform came. He rose in rank, not because he wanted stripes, but because men gravitated toward whoever kept them alive. War had a way of accelerating everything: childhood, leadership, death. And Murphy moved through it like someone who had never been given the luxury of hesitation. By the time the Germans pulled out of Sicily, he had become something unusual. A quiet, small, unassuming killer who never celebrated a single shot. Italy hardened that instinct further. The mountains were crueler, the mud endless, the winter soaked into the bones. Men froze, men starved, men drowned in flooded foxholes. But Murphy kept moving, kept scanning, kept reading terrain the way he once read animal tracks. Outside Naples, he led a patrol through olive groves thick with enemy scouts. They walked into a German ambush, and before the first man screamed for cover, Murphy was already firing, dropping 3 silhouettes in the same measured rhythm that would one day make colonels whisper his name. He dragged 2 wounded men out of the kill zone, shoved another behind a stone wall, and returned fire until the grove fell silent. Officers noted his calm. Soldiers noted his accuracy. Murphy noted nothing. He simply breathed and reloaded. When Anzio bogged down into a nightmare of shellfire and trench rot, Murphy went inward. He became quieter, leaner, more watchful. German mortars pounded the beachhead so constantly that whole platoons flinched at shadows. Murphy did not flinch. He counted the seconds between salvos, knew when to move, knew when to duck, knew when to stand and fire. A rifleman watching him said, "He's like a machine, a tired, angry machine that don't break." By the time the Allies broke out and pushed north, Murphy had been wounded. He had malaria. He had lost so much weight he barely looked human. But his eyes remained sharp. He fought through the Apennines, through villages where walls fell like rotten fruit under artillery, through nights when the only light was tracers and burning barns. With each skirmish he grew more deadly, more certain, more precise. Southern France in 1944 brought something new: speed. Operation Dragoon dropped his division onto a coastline the Germans barely defended, and Murphy moved inland with a confidence that startled even him. In the hills around Montélimar, he crawled toward a German machine gun nest alone, weaving through dust clouds kicked up by retreating half-tracks. When the gun pivoted toward his squad, Murphy rose and fired from a standing position, dropping every man on the gun in under 3 seconds. His captain stared at him afterward and muttered, "You cannot keep doing that." But Murphy wasn't doing anything. He was surviving, and survival had always looked like this. By autumn, his reputation had outrun his size. Men whispered that he could smell danger. Others joked he was half wild, half myth. Germans who saw him in the distance mistook him for a messenger boy until he opened fire. His division pushed through the Rhone Valley like a blade, and Murphy followed orders with a grim efficiency that frightened his own officers. When a group of German soldiers pretended to surrender and then shot one of his closest friends dead, Murphy hunted them down with such ferocity that the platoon medic refused to speak of it afterward. Grief made him silent, but silence made him lethal. He stopped smiling. He stopped sleeping. What little was left of childhood burned away in that French orchard, where his friend fell bleeding into dust. The Vosges Mountains came next, a different kind of hell. Dense forests, fog that swallowed whole companies, ravines that funneled gunfire like echo chambers, German artillery hidden in slopes that seemed to breathe smoke. In that maze of trees and wet earth, Murphy's instincts evolved into something uncanny. He sensed ambushes before they happened. He flanked machine guns by following deer trails. He spotted movement others missed. His platoon began watching him the way men at sea watch a compass. If Murphy paused, they paused. If Murphy scanned the tree line, rifles came up. War had taught him fluency in fear. Then came January 1945, the battle that would seal his legend. Holtzwihr. A dawn that felt like glass. Snow crusted over mud, turning fields into mirrors for muzzle flashes. Fog rolled through the pines like breath from a giant's lungs. German armour massed on the far tree line, engines rumbling deep and patient. Murphy's company was shattered from weeks of attrition, down to barely 100 men. The enemy had tanks, self-propelled guns, infantry fresh enough to charge without stumbling. Murphy had a handful of exhausted soldiers and a frozen ditch. When the attack came, it came like an avalanche. Panzers crawled from the fog, their silhouettes monstrous in the half-light. Artillery cracked overhead, showering dirt. Machine guns traced fire across the snow. The line bent. Men shouted. Officers fell. Murphy saw all of it at once. The collapse, the inevitability, the death rolling toward them, and something in him rebelled against it. Not with a shout, not with rage. With a single decision that no sane man would have made, he ordered his men back. "Fall back to the tree line," he said. "I'll hold them." They hesitated, thinking they misheard. But Murphy's tone was not theatrical, not heroic, just certain. He pointed them toward safety and turned alone toward the German attack. A burning tank destroyer sat nearby, its .50 caliber machine gun still intact. Flames licked at the hull. Ammunition inside cooked off with sharp metallic bangs. Smoke curled around the gun mount. The vehicle was a coffin waiting for a body. Murphy climbed onto it anyway. He opened fire. The .50 caliber roared, stitching fire across the snow, hitting infantry so fast they folded before they realized someone was shooting. German gunners tried to angle weapons toward him, but Murphy was small, half hidden in black smoke, a ghost with teeth. He swept the line left to right, cutting down squads as they tried to advance. Tanks halted, uncertain. Their commanders could not understand why the American line had not collapsed. They could not understand the volume of fire coming from one burning vehicle. An entire German company poured fire at him. Bullets snapped past his head. Shrapnel sliced his coat. The burning destroyer groaned under him like an animal dying. Murphy kept firing. His face was calm, his breathing steady. When his ammunition ran low, he adjusted his aim and kept hitting targets. When German infantry tried to flank him, he shifted position and cut them down. Radio operators in the rear heard his voice over the headset. Quiet, unshaken, calling artillery onto his own coordinates because that was where the enemy stood. For an hour, he fought alone. When the Germans finally broke and fell back, when smoke drifted sideways in the wind and the fields quieted except for the low moan of wounded men, Murphy climbed down from the smouldering wreckage and walked back to his men. One soldier stared at him and whispered, "You're not human." Another simply touched his shoulder as if to confirm he was real. Murphy did not celebrate. He did not look proud. He just said, "They're pulling back. Let's counterattack." That was the moment. More than the medals, more than the citations, more than the reporters who would later stalk him, that defined him. Not the heroism, the refusal to surrender when everything said surrender was correct. Holtzwihr became the turning point of the Colmar Pocket. A single action in a single forest that shifted the weight of a whole campaign. But for Murphy, it was just another day he survived. He would survive more. But survival after Holtzwihr did not mean recovery. When the officers gathered him that evening and told him what he had done, he looked at them as if they were describing someone else. They said he had saved the entire line. They said he had killed dozens. They said he had delayed a full German assault long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Murphy listened without expression, the firelight flickering over a face that looked much older than 19. He shrugged. "They were going to kill us," he said. "I just stopped them." That was all. Word spread up the chain of command like a rumor too outrageous to be true. Generals asked to meet him. Staff officers stared at him as if expecting a giant, not a compact, hollow-cheeked Texan, barely heavier than the rifle he carried. He accepted their handshakes politely, quietly, almost awkwardly. No one looking at him would have guessed that he was now the most dangerous man in the 3rd Infantry Division, or that he was only getting colder inside. The days after Holtzwihr felt strangely muted. The forest was still deadly. The snow still soaked through boots. The artillery still cracked the air like splitting timber. But everything seemed slower, louder, too bright. The men around Murphy noticed he barely slept. When he did drift off, he jolted awake, gasping, fingers curled as if still squeezing the trigger of the .50 caliber. He walked the perimeter of their positions at night, alone, listening to the wind move through the treetops. He told one sergeant, almost apologetically, "I'm jumpy." The sergeant looked at him and thought, if he's jumpy, we're doomed. There was no rest. The Colmar Pocket still had to be cleared. German forces were dug in across villages that looked like frozen wounds, shattered barns, stone walls blown open, church towers leaning at impossible angles. Murphy's unit advanced through one hamlet after another, kicking in doors, flushing snipers from rafters, exchanging fire across orchards where every tree trunk hid a rifle barrel. The fighting was close, intimate, the kind of war where death arrived from 15 feet away, sometimes less. Murphy's instincts sharpened further. He could tell when a house was occupied by the way a window curtain moved. He could sense a sniper from the unnatural silence in an attic. One lieutenant swore Murphy had a sixth sense. "No," a sergeant replied. "He just hears things we don't." In one village, the name hardly mattered, they all blended together into a geography of ruin. A German machine gun nest fired down a narrow lane, pinning Murphy's platoon behind a stone wall. Snow burst into white plumes as bullets struck. Murphy peeked once, ducked back, then sprinted across the street so fast and so suddenly that the gunner overshot him entirely. He hit the opposite wall, slid into a doorway, kicked it open, and found himself inside a house whose floor vibrated with the machine gun's rhythm. He moved upstairs, boots crunching broken plaster. The gunner never heard him. Murphy shot him through the back of the neck, then opened the window and fired down at German infantry trying to flank the platoon. When the firing finally stopped, the men across the street stared at the window, expecting someone larger, older, harsher to appear. Instead, Murphy stepped out of the doorway, brushing dust off his jacket like a man returning from a chore. It was around this time that officers began pulling him aside with increasing frequency. They spoke gently, respectfully, suggesting he rotate off the line. He had done enough, more than enough. Men with half his citations were already in rear echelon roles, training replacements or assisting staff units. But Murphy refused every time. "They need me here," he said simply. And it was true. Morale lifted when he was near, not because he told jokes or inspired speeches, but because he moved with the unspoken assurance of someone the war itself hadn't beaten. When the Colmar pocket finally collapsed in early February, Murphy's division pivoted toward the next objective, the Rhine, the German heartland, the last and greatest barrier between the Allies and the final destruction of the Third Reich. The Rhine had always loomed large in military history, the kind of river that generals spoke of as if it were alive, wide, fast, frigid. Guarded by positions the Germans had fortified for generations. Crossing it would mean pushing into the lungs of the enemy. Murphy understood this. He didn't say much, but he understood. In late March, his unit marched toward the riverbanks under a cold, iron-coloured sky. The closer they came, the more the earth shook with artillery. Even at a distance, the Rhine felt immense, a black ribbon reflecting fires burning on its eastern shore. Bridges lay collapsed into the water like the ribs of dead animals. Smoke curled upward in twisting columns. The smell of diesel, mud, and explosives lingered like a stain in the air. Engineers whispered that this crossing would be different, that the Germans were waiting, that they had sighted their guns so perfectly that the first wave would be shredded before reaching the halfway point. Murphy listened to these conversations while cleaning his rifle, though he hardly needed to. That weapon had become an extension of his hand, always ready. The night before the crossing, he barely slept again. He lay awake listening to the soft breathing of the men around him inside a ruined barn. Some murmured in their dreams. Others clutched rosaries. One man, a replacement only 19 years old, quietly wept into his sleeve. Murphy placed a hand on the man's shoulder without speaking. It was the only comfort he could give. Before dawn, they moved out. They reached the riverbank in silence, boots sinking into wet sand. Fog drifted across the water in thick, slow-moving shapes, lit faintly by flares drifting overhead like dying stars. Engineers pushed assault boats into the current, their metal hulls scraped against stones. Somewhere downstream, a German machine gun test-fired a burst, a skeletal sound that rattled like teeth in the darkness. Murphy's platoon boarded a boat, every man trying to make himself smaller. A lieutenant whispered, "Once we're halfway across, they'll open up." Murphy looked at the fog and said nothing. Oars dipped quietly at first. Then the current grabbed hold, pulling them faster than they liked. On the far bank, shadows shifted. German silhouettes climbing into firing positions. The fog thinned as if the river itself exhaled. Then the world erupted. Machine guns erupted in yellow arcs. Mortars thumped like fists hitting the sky. Artillery screamed overhead and slammed into the water with geysers that rocked the boats violently. Splinters, spray, sand, and smoke filled the air. Men shouted, ducked, cursed, prayed. One boat ahead of Murphy's took a direct hit from a mortar. It vanished into steam and flame, leaving only screams fading under the current. Murphy did not duck. He sighted along his rifle, braced his elbows against the boat's rim, and fired at the muzzle flashes on the shore. His shots were steady, controlled, impossibly calm. Every time a German gunner rose to fire again, Murphy put him down. When the boat skidded sideways under the force of the current, he shifted stance without breaking rhythm. The men around him saw it, that glassy, focused stare. the one he always had when the world turned violent. As they neared the far bank, the firing intensified. Bullets tore through the wooden boards of the boat. A man beside Murphy jerked backward and slid into the river, disappearing beneath the surface. Another dropped his oar and grabbed his bleeding thigh. The lieutenant yelled for everyone to jump the moment they scraped bottom. Murphy nodded once, never looking away from the shore. The boat ground against mud. "Go!" the lieutenant shouted. They leapt into knee-deep water, stumbling through reeds and debris. A machine gun nest opened fire at an oblique angle, pinning half the platoon behind a collapsed jetty. Murphy sprinted toward a cluster of rocks, skidding behind them as bullets spat sparks from the granite. He fired 3 shots, reloaded, fired 3 more. One by one, the machine gun crew stopped firing. He moved forward without waiting for orders. The shore was a labyrinth of trenches, broken walls, and burned-out houses. Germans fired from windows blown into jagged mouths. They tossed grenades from cellar hatches. They moved quickly, desperately, knowing this was the last river that mattered. Murphy led his men through a gap in a stone wall, clearing a courtyard where chickens scattered in terror as bullets drilled the dirt around them. He kicked open a wooden door and immediately dove aside as a German soldier fired wildly through the doorway. Murphy rolled, came up on one knee, and shot the man twice. Upstairs, he found a sniper's nest, empty now, with a view of the crossing that made his breath stop. From that vantage point, the river looked like a churning battlefield of shattered boats, men wading through water up to their chests, tracer rounds stitching patterns across the fog, artillery throwing up plumes that briefly illuminated floating bodies. He forced himself to look away. They fought house to house for hours, each block a miniature war. Fires burned unchecked. Smoke rolled down alleys. German soldiers surrendered in some places and fought fanatically in others. Murphy's platoon pressed forward, room by room, yard by yard. He seemed immune to exhaustion, as if the chaos around him sharpened rather than drained him. When a German squad tried to flank the platoon from a narrow alley, Murphy intercepted them alone, dropping 2 before the others fled into the smoke. By late afternoon they had secured a foothold on the far bank, though the cost was evident in the silence of the wounded and the empty spaces where men had stood that morning. An officer approached Murphy, shaking his head in disbelief. "You should be dead 10 times over," he muttered. Murphy simply replied, "We made it across." The officer nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "because you led the way." But if the Rhine was the last great natural barrier, Germany itself was a maze of defences built on streets and stones, hills and forests, old foundations and new fears. And Murphy, as broken and as hardened as he had become, plunged deeper still. Germany beyond the Rhine did not resemble a nation anymore. It resembled the echo of one, a place where roads were cracked open by bomb craters, where forests were pocked with shell holes, where houses stood roofless like skulls bleached by wind. Every mile the 3rd Infantry Division advanced felt like a reckoning. German resistance stiffened, not because they still believed they could win, but because the cost of surrender had become unthinkable for many. Hitler's orders were absolute. Fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last breath. Murphy saw the consequences everywhere. Children with hollow cheeks dragging carts of firewood. Elderly men in tattered uniforms holding antique rifles. Teenagers drafted into the Volkssturm, trembling as they fired Panzerfausts with hands that should have held schoolbooks. The war had eaten everything: grain, steel, horses, hope, and now it was eating its own people. For Murphy, the landscape mirrored his mind, fractured, smoke-filled, dimmed by grief. His company moved through a ruined town near Würzburg, the streets narrow and twisted, perfect killing lanes for German defenders. Snipers hid in steeples, machine guns fired from basements. Artillery, firing blind from miles away, shook the cobblestones with each distant roar. It was the kind of fighting Murphy excelled at, not because he enjoyed it, but because he seemed able to move through it like a ghost that no bullet could quite catch. At one intersection, a German MG-42 opened up without warning, pinning 2 squads behind a toppled horse cart. Tracers tore splinters from the cart's wooden frame. Men shouted for smoke grenades, but none were within reach. The gunner had the entire street locked down. Murphy didn't hesitate. He sprinted into a doorway, kicked it open, and vanished inside the house. The others held their breath, listening to the machine gun's relentless buzz. 30 seconds passed, then 60. Then, silence. A moment later, Murphy reappeared on the second floor, leaning out a shattered window with the smoking remains of a German machine gun belt in his hand. "They're done," he said simply, and climbed back down. No one asked how he had crossed the hallway without being cut down. No one asked how he ascended the stairs without being heard. At some point, the questions stopped mattering. Men simply accepted a new rule of war. When Murphy moved, the enemy died. But even legends bleed. German artillery struck their temporary billets one night, shells landing so close that the earth lifted in waves. A blast hurled Murphy across a room, slamming him into a wall hard enough to fracture bone. He refused evacuation despite the medics' protests, claiming he could still walk, still fight. He wrapped his ribs with cloth, clenched his teeth, and carried on. Pain became another background noise, no different from the distant rumble of tanks or the hiss of mortar rounds. His division pushed toward Nuremberg next, the symbolic city of the Reich, where torchlit parades had once celebrated a promised era of dominance. Now those grand avenues were rubble, the stone eagles toppled, the banners burned to ash. The fighting inside the city was savage, house to house, courtyard to courtyard, stairwell to stairwell. Germans fought from behind carved pillars, from trenches carved into opera houses, from cellars lined with jars of pickled vegetables that shattered when grenades detonated. Murphy was everywhere at once. When a squad was pinned down on the northern approach, Murphy flanked the machine gun nest through a collapsed theatre, sneaking beneath velvet curtains still smelling faintly of dust and smoke. When another platoon stalled near a government building, he moved along a balcony with fallen marble columns to shoot down at German riflemen who mistakenly believed the upper floors had all been cleared. His presence was like a rumour soldiers whispered between breaths. "Murphy's here. We'll get through this." But the pressure was immense. He had become a symbol, and symbols are expected to perform miracles. He rarely spoke of fear, but it lived inside him, a small, hardened knot beneath his ribs. He was afraid not of death, but of failing the men who believed in him, of letting someone die because he wasn't fast enough, sharp enough, ruthless enough. It drove him harder, pushed him into the darkest corners of combat, made him take risks no sane man would take. And then came the incident outside Gunzenhausen, the one that stayed with him long after the shooting stopped. His platoon was advancing along a wooded road when a German mortar team fired from a hidden position. The first shell exploded among the rear ranks, killing a young private Murphy had spoken to only hours earlier. The next shell landed near a cluster of trees, spraying bark and metal fragments in every direction. Men ducked and scattered, searching desperately for the mortar's location. Murphy didn't scatter. He moved forward, slipping into the tree line, scanning the ground for footprints, disturbed leaves, anything. He heard the faint metallic clink of a mortar round being dropped into a tube. He moved toward it, stepping lightly over roots and branches until he saw them. 3 Germans crouched beside a shallow pit, preparing another round. He didn't aim from a distance. He walked up behind them. 2 fell before they even turned. The third tried to run, slipping on the wet leaves. Murphy tackled him, and for a moment, a brief, flickering moment, the world narrowed to 2 men wrestling on the forest floor, breath steaming in the cold air. Murphy subdued him, but afterward, as he walked back toward the road with the prisoner in tow, he looked shaken in a way his men had never seen. Killing at a distance was one thing. Killing at arm's reach was another. They saw it in his eyes. He was growing tired, not physically, but spiritually. War was hollowing him out from the inside. Yet he pressed on. The division advanced deeper into Bavaria, where hills rolled like waves beneath a grey sky. Farmhouses burned. German refugees fled along muddy roads with wagons piled high with furniture and blankets. For the first time, Murphy saw the war from the perspective of civilians who had nothing to do with strategy, ideology, or orders. They were simply caught in the gears of a machine too massive to stop. Children stared at him with equal parts fear and curiosity. Old women crossed themselves when soldiers passed. An elderly man tried to hand Murphy a loaf of bread, his hands shaking so badly the crust crumbled. Murphy took it gently, nodded, and walked on. Later he broke the bread into pieces and gave it to the younger soldiers, saying nothing. Even as the German army disintegrated, pockets of resistance remained fierce. SS units, in particular, fought with fanatic loyalty, carrying out ambushes along winding mountain roads. In one such ambush near the outskirts of Dillingen, Murphy's convoy was hit by Panzerfausts fired from a barn. Flames engulfed the lead vehicle. Men jumped into ditches as gunfire erupted from the tree line. Murphy was out of the truck before it even rolled to a stop. He ran low across the field, bullets snapping past his ears. He reached the barn's side door, kicked it open, and shot 2 SS troopers who were reloading their launchers. Another tried to fire from the loft, but Murphy shot him before he could aim. The fight lasted less than 20 seconds. When his men finally caught up, they found the barn smoking, the threat eliminated. One private whispered, "How is he still alive?" Another replied, "Because he doesn't stop to think about dying." But the truth was more complicated. Murphy did think about dying, constantly. He just didn't care anymore. Not in a suicidal sense, but in a resigned sense. The war had become an endless grind of faces he couldn't remember, voices he would never hear again, and choices made in fractions of seconds. Life and death were no longer opposites. They were neighbouring rooms, separated by a thin wall he crossed so often it felt meaningless. Still, he pushed on. Because the men beside him needed him. Because the war wasn't finished. Because nothing, not bullets, not fire, not fear, ever stopped him before. As the 3rd Infantry Division closed in on southern Germany, the landscape shifted. Forests thickened. Mountains rose like dark fortresses. Rivers ran cold with snowmelt. German units fell back in disorganized retreats, but the terrain gave them natural choke points to fight from. Bridges were blown. Roads were mined. Every advance fraught with ambushes. Murphy fought through it all, and then, near a small Bavarian village whose name he could barely pronounce, the war reached its final crescendo for him. Not in a heroic stand like Holtzwihr, not in a dramatic river crossing, but in a moment of quiet horror that would follow him for the rest of his life. They approached the village at dawn. A thin mist clung to the fields, and smoke curled from chimneys where families were still trying to pretend normalcy existed. Birds perched on the blackened timbers of barns that had survived artillery blasts by luck alone. The village looked peaceful from a distance, the way so many places looked peaceful until the first shot revealed the truth. Murphy's platoon advanced cautiously along a dirt lane lined with saplings whose new spring leaves glowed faintly in the early light. The men were spread out, rifles held low but ready. They had learned long ago that the danger in Germany wasn't always where officers predicted. It lurked behind shutters, in ditches, in cellars, where the darkness hid the last stubborn believers in a collapsing Reich. A German shot cracked from an upstairs window, the bullet striking the road and spraying dust into Murphy's face. Instantly, his men dove behind fences and carts. Murphy moved toward the shot instead of away from it, slipping along the shadows cast by the village's stone church. He rounded the corner and saw it, a teenage sniper, maybe 16, perched beneath a slanted roof tile, eyes wide with terror and defiance both. The boy fumbled to chamber another round. Murphy leveled his rifle, but something stopped him. The boy's hands were shaking. His elbows were tucked in the same way American recruits held their rifles on their first day. His face, smudged with soot, streaked with tears, was not that of an ideologue, not a fanatic, not one of the hardened SS men who had ambushed them days earlier. He was a child thrown into a machine built by adults who would never pay the price. "Drop it," Murphy said softly. The boy froze. For a moment, neither moved. The dawn light flickered across the broken roof tiles. The only sound was the faint crackle of a fire smouldering inside a nearby stable. Murphy repeated it, firmer now. "Drop it." The rifle slipped from the boy's shaking hands. It clattered onto the wooden floorboards. He raised both hands, eyes full of a fear so raw Murphy felt it in his chest. "Run," Murphy said. "Go home." The boy fled. When Murphy rejoined his platoon, he said nothing. He didn't explain. He didn't justify. None of the men asked. They simply moved on. But inside, Murphy felt something shift, something he couldn't name. Maybe it was pity. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe the realization that even the enemy had run out of real soldiers. Or maybe it was the first crack in the wall he had built between himself and the horror of what he'd done for months on end. War was winding down. But inside him, something was unraveling. The fighting didn't stop. Pockets of SS resistance fought with suicidal stubbornness. Bridges had to be cleared of explosives. Roads mined by retreating engineers had to be crossed inch by inch. Every day brought new danger, new decisions, new ghosts. But the scale of German collapse was unmistakable. Convoys of surrendering troops clogged crossroads. Entire regiments emerged from forests waving makeshift white flags. Villagers begged for the Americans to arrive before SS units could execute reprisals. The war was entering its final frenzied stage, half chaos, half relief. And still, Murphy moved forward, never slowing, never hesitating. In one forested ravine, German machine gun fire erupted from two directions at once. The platoon dove for cover. Murphy crawled ahead alone, weaving through fallen branches. He identified the first gun by the rhythm of its bursts, too even, too controlled, and targeted the gunner as he reloaded. The second gun he circled around entirely, climbing a moss-covered slope so steep he had to dig his fingers into the dirt to pull himself up. He flanked it, fired point blank, and signaled the platoon forward. They secured the ravine with minimal casualties. "He doesn't fear anything," one soldier whispered afterward. But that was wrong. Murphy feared everything. He just didn't let it stop him. By mid-April 1945, the 3rd Infantry Division pushed toward the Danube, the last major river before the Alps. Rumors swirled that Hitler was hiding in the mountains to form a national redoubt. Others said Berlin was already burning. Most soldiers didn't care anymore. They only wanted to make it through the last miles without losing more friends. Murphy rode in the back of a jeep with his carbine across his lap. His gaze drifted across fields bursting with spring growth. For a moment, Germany looked beautiful. Then the jeep crested a hill and the beauty shattered. A labour camp lay in the valley below, barbed wire, guard towers, rows of barracks built from rotting planks. Figures who barely looked human moving through the yard like shadows broken loose from the earth. Murphy stared silently. He didn't speak for a long time. Later, when the platoon secured the camp, when the prisoners reached out with trembling hands, when the smell of starvation and sickness clung to every surface, Murphy walked away alone, leaned against a fence post, and closed his eyes. He had fought so long, killed so many, survived so much, and still nothing had prepared him for this. The camp was proof that the war had never been about rivers or towns or strategies. It was about stopping this. Stopping the machine that had built this place. For the first time, Murphy understood why there could be no halfway victory. Why he had kept fighting even when exhaustion hollowed him out. Why none of this, none of it, could ever be allowed to happen again. A few days later, in a wooded village near the Austrian border, Murphy fought what would become his final battle of the war. The enemy was a group of SS diehards refusing to surrender. They ambushed the platoon from a cluster of stone outbuildings, firing Panzerfausts and automatic rifles. The first blast sent debris flying. The second shattered a wagon and injured 2 Americans. The third struck a tree, showering splinters like shrapnel. Murphy charged forward before anyone else. He sprinted into a barn, climbed into the hayloft, and used the elevated height to shoot down into the SS positions. When they tried to flank, he dropped through a gap in the boards and landed behind them, firing with a cold efficiency that shocked even the veterans who had fought beside him since '43. The firefight lasted almost 20 minutes. When it ended, 8 SS soldiers lay dead. Murphy stood among the debris, chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. Smoke drifted around him. Ash clung to his jacket. His eyes were not triumphant. They were old, impossibly old for someone not yet 21. A sergeant approached him. "Murph, it's over. They're done." Murphy lowered his rifle. "Good," he said softly. "Let's go home." Germany surrendered weeks later. The celebrations rang out through cities and camps and oceans away across America. But for Murphy, the end was strangely quiet. He sat on a wooden crate outside a requisitioned hostel, listening to the muffled laughter of soldiers celebrating inside. He felt detached, alive, but not entirely present. He thought of the boys he enlisted with who never made it home. He thought of France's orchards riddled with shrapnel. He thought of the frozen forest at Holtzwihr. He thought of the German boy sniper who ran when Murphy told him to. He thought of the camp. He thought of the cost. A few days later, his commanding officer called him into a small office. Papers were stacked on a desk. A wooden chair sat opposite. The officer gestured for Murphy to sit. "You'll be awarded the Medal of Honor," the officer said quietly. Murphy blinked. He didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. He simply nodded. It wasn't pride he felt. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't even relief. It was something closer to gravity, the weight of everything he had done, everything he had survived, everything he would now forever represent. He had become the most decorated soldier in American history, and all he wanted was sleep. They shipped him home in June 1945. The war-torn landscapes of Europe vanished beneath the clouds, replaced by the green patchwork of American farmland. The contrast felt unreal, as if he had stepped from one lifetime into another without any transition. When the plane landed, reporters crowded the tarmac, shouting questions, flashing cameras, treating him like a myth made flesh. They wanted stories. They wanted drama. They wanted the legend. Murphy wanted silence. He gave polite answers, short and plain, his voice steady but distant. Behind him, the country was celebrating triumph. Parades, streamers, headlines, victory songs played on radios. But inside his mind, the war kept replaying. Not the ceremonies or the medals, but the roads littered with shell fragments, the screams in the night, the gun smoke hanging in winter air, the faces of men he couldn't save. A government car drove him to Texas, where his arrival stirred crowds in a way that embarrassed him deeply. Former neighbors hugged him. Old schoolmates stared at him with awe. Mothers introduced their children to the bravest man in America. He smiled politely, but the attention left him feeling exposed, raw. The boy who once slept in fields to stay warm, who picked cotton barefoot and hungry, who lied about his age to escape poverty, that boy had died somewhere in Europe. What returned was someone else entirely. His family saw it when they looked into his eyes. There was a distance there, a heaviness no celebration could lift. Months passed. Invitations poured in, speaking engagements, interviews, banquets, patriotic events. Murphy attended some out of obligation, but each one drained him. He felt like an actor performing the role of Audie Murphy rather than the man himself. Hollywood called next. Producers, dazzled by his decorations and good looks, wanted him on screen. Murphy resisted at first. He didn't trust the glamour. He didn't want to be the center of attention. But eventually, needing income and urged by friends, he traveled to California. Hollywood did what Hollywood always did. It mythologized. War heroes became commodities. Courage became a script. Trauma became a storyline. Men who had bled in snow and mud now reenacted battles beneath bright studio lights. Murphy found it surreal, sometimes even offensive, but he played along. It was work. It was survival. And part of him believed that maybe, just maybe, telling the story truthfully could honor those who didn't come home. So when the time came to film To Hell and Back, the movie adaptation of his own war memoir, Murphy agreed reluctantly to portray himself. No one else, he said, should play the men he fought beside. No one else should stand where they had fallen. And when cameras rolled, Murphy didn't perform. He remembered. He walked through recreated French towns with the same posture, the same movements, the same expressions he'd worn in battle, Extras and cameramen sometimes noticed tears in his eyes after a take. He wasn't acting, he was reliving. The film became the highest-grossing war movie in American history at the time. Audiences hailed him as a symbol of American courage, which he was. But symbols, once created, are expected to remain perfect. They are not allowed to flinch. They are not allowed to break. They are not allowed to be human. Murphy was human, and he was breaking. In private, the nightmares began. Gunshots echoing in the dark, the screams of wounded men, the roar of artillery, the metallic taste of smoke in his throat. He woke drenched in sweat, gripping the sheets as if they were a rifle stock. Sometimes he slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. Other times he paced the house until dawn, unable to shake the feeling that he was still in a foxhole, still hearing the crack of a sniper's rifle somewhere in the tree line. Today, we call it PTSD. Back then, it was called battle fatigue, or nerves, or simply silence. Murphy didn't talk about it much. When he did, it was only in rare, honest moments with close friends. He admitted he could never quite escape the war. It lived inside him, flickering like a projector that refused to turn off. The price of survival, he realized, was carrying the ghosts of men who didn't. He tried to manage it. He threw himself into work, acting in films, writing, ranching. He advocated publicly for veterans suffering from psychological trauma, one of the first major public figures to do so. He testified before Congress, urging better treatment for those whose wounds couldn't be seen. He spoke plainly, powerfully, from experience. They are not weak, they are wounded. The statement shocked America, but he was right. Murphy knew firsthand that bravery on the battlefield did not protect a man from suffering afterward. If anything, the bravest often carried the heaviest burdens. He carried his with quiet dignity. It was the same dignity he'd shown as a teenager walking alone into a recruiting station, as a soldier fighting across 3 continents, as a hero standing on a burning tank destroyer while the world collapsed around him. Murphy lived the rest of his life with the same contradictions that defined his youth. He was gentle but carried unimaginable violence inside him. He was shy but famous worldwide. He was adored by millions, yet felt deeply alone. He was strong enough to face death 100 times, but fragile enough that sleep sometimes terrified him. But he never lost his sense of purpose. He mentored young actors. He supported veterans quietly, often donating money without fanfare. He continued working, always trying, always moving, because stopping meant remembering. On May 28, 1971, at the age of 45, Audie Murphy died in a plane crash in the Appalachian Mountains. The news stunned the country. Flags dropped to half-mast in multiple states. Veterans wept openly. Newspapers printed long columns detailing his decorations, every medal, every citation, every act of courage that had once seemed too outrageous to be real. But the true measure of his life wasn't in the medals. It was in the men who lived because of him, the towns he liberated, the children who grew up in peace because Murphy and others like him refused to break in the darkest hours of human history. On his headstone at Arlington National Cemetery, one of the most visited graves in the entire cemetery, there is no special decoration, no bold lettering, no golden wreath. Just a simple white marker with his name, his rank, and a list of medals engraved with quiet understatement. It is exactly the way he wanted it. The legend didn't matter. The story did. Audie Murphy remains the most decorated American soldier of World War II. But the numbers, as staggering as they are, still fail to capture who he truly was. Because the truth isn't that he fought alone. It's that he fought when there was no one else left to fight. He faced fear and walked forward anyway. He faced death and refused to yield. He carried burdens no young man should carry. He rose from poverty, loss, and hunger to become the embodiment of quiet, relentless courage. His story endures not because he was larger than life, but because he wasn't. He was a boy who lied about his age, a teenager who fought in 3 countries, a man who stood on top of a burning tank destroyer and held back an army because no one else could. He was human, but in the moments that mattered most, he was something more. A shield, a spear, a survivor, a symbol of what ordinary people can become when history demands the extraordinary. Audie Murphy didn't set out to be a legend. He simply refused to run. And because of that, thousands lived.